Okay, so David says here in 15:9, 2 Samuel 15:9, go in peace. So he goes. And he sends secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel. As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then proclaim Absalom as king in Hebron. Now what they would do with these trumpets, and I thought this was really interesting when I was reading it this afternoon, was that they would position trumpeters sometimes a couple of miles apart on the tops of the hills. And so you could start a trumpet blast down here, and on this hilltop, they would hear the trumpet blast, they would blast their trumpet, and that trumpet would be heard by another trumpeter on another. And so in a very short amount of time, all throughout Israel, the trumpets could have been sounded, and people are proclaiming Absalom is king. And so he's got 200 men from Jerusalem, verse 11, that go with him. These guys are clueless. They went innocently. They didn't know anything about it. And so while he's offering the sacrifices, he sends for a key individual. Now we haven't been told yet how key and how important this guy is. It's after the fact that we find out. But it's very, very significant that he calls for him here. The guy's name is Ahithophel. And he is David's counselor, and he sends for him to come. Now, what you don't know, unless you connect the dots, is who Ahithophel is. Ahithophel was the father of Eliam, who was one of David's mighty men. Eliam was the father of Bathsheba. Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. And so, why did Absalom appeal to Ahithophel? Because he knew that Ahithophel was bitter because of what David had done to Uriah and how David had taken Bathsheba as his own wife. And so he knew that he was ripe to be brought into the conspiracy. But not only that, but Ahithophel, we find out later, is the kind of guy who gives such wisdom. When the king asked him a question and said, what should I do about this? It was like talking to God. And it makes that statement later on, that Ahithophel's wisdom was like talking to God. And so Absalom pulls Ahithophel into the conspiracy. And so the conspiracy, look what it says in the end of verse 12. It says, the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. Well, somebody leaked the information, and David found out. And somebody comes to David and says, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. So David now has been blindsided by something he never expected. He never expected. I mean, he had been successful against all the other kings. Every other kingdom around him was bowing in submission to him. His problems were from within. And so David now is ready to deal with that. And I got a few things that I want to share with you about that. How to respond when you've been blindsided by a negative situation. All of us at one time or another are going to face that. Somebody that we don't expect is going to, out of the blue, turn against us, hurt us in some way. And I think the first thing that we've got to understand is that negative things are going to come. Whether we expect them or whether we don't expect them, they're going to happen. They're going to come. So we need to try to be prepared for them. But then we need to respond wisely. And the first thing that I see that David does is look at this. He says to his officials, verse 14, and to all that were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword. Now think for a minute. What do we know about Jerusalem already? Well, we know that when David became king over all Israel, he had already been king of Judah, became king of Israel, he moved to conquer Jerusalem. He wanted the city. The people that were living in the city of Jerusalem, the Jebusites, were so confident about the defendability of the city of Jerusalem that they said to him, why, if we posted just lame and blind people everywhere around our city, we could keep David out of here. That's how defensible Jerusalem was. So why does David all of a sudden say, oh, we got to leave. We got to go. Got to get out of here. So Absalom could not have that easily conquered Jerusalem. It would have taken a long, long time. Well, there's a couple of reasons why it seems like David may have decided we need to go. Number one is that he may not have had provisions for a lengthy siege. He knew his son enough to know that he's not going to quit until he's done. The siege at Jerusalem, now when you fast forward years and years in the future, when Jerusalem actually fell, it was under siege for a long period of time. And David may have known he didn't have the provisions, supplies. He had plenty of men there in the city to defend it, but he may have needed more. And he may have realized that if he did stay in the city, and after a lengthy conquest, they're conquered, that was it. Help was not going to come from anywhere else. But if he got out of the city, then he could appeal to people of the nation of Israel all around. And so there's a number of reasons why David may have decided to go ahead and go. Fleeing the city also would have helped to preserve this city. David loved Jerusalem. David had done a lot of work in Jerusalem, and he really, it was next to David's heart. And David may not have wanted to see it come under siege and be attacked. He even cared about his palace enough that when he did leave, he chose 10 of his 30-plus wives and concubines, and the 10 concubines were to stay there and care for the palace. He really cared about this place. He didn't want it to be destroyed, and so he felt like he'd rather get out and let Absalom come in and just trust God to provide for him out there. And so as as he's going, look what happens here now. The king sets out. He leaves those 10 concubines to take care of the palace, and all the people that are there go with him. Now, who is all the people? Well, you remember that David had those 30 mighty men, and when he was traveling among the Philistines, he had 600 men and their families, and it is very likely that these men who started with him are also with David in the city of Jerusalem. And so he's got those men and maybe their sons who have grown now into fighting men. He also has a group known as the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And I've mentioned this to you before, but the Kerethites and Pelethites were Philistines who had gotten attached to David while he was living in Philistine territory before he ever became king. They were with him there in the city. And now there's another group too. There's this guy named Ittai. And who in the world is Ittai? Well, he's from Gath. It says he's a Gittite, which means he's from the city of Gath, which was the city where Achish, the king of Gath, lived, and where David had stayed for a year and a half, or he had been interacting with them for a year and a half. And this Ittai has got 600 soldiers with him. Now, David had a considerable army at his disposal right there, but he decides to leave. And so Ittai, he says to him, why should you come? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You're a foreigner. You're in exile from your homeland. This fellow had gotten kicked out. I wonder why. It wasn't until today that I came across something that explained that. And I think it makes sense. What if David, when he was in Philistine territory, had an influence on the family of Achish, the king, to a degree that one of Achish's sons converted to David's religion? There is some thought with at least one or two of the commentators that this Ittai was in fact the son of Achish, the king of Gath, the king of the Philistines, and that he was in fact exiled because he had converted to the religion of David and the Jews. And so now he's come, and so we've got all these guys, the Kerethites, Pelethites, David's 30 guys, and probably the 600 that were with him initially, and the new 600 that are with Ittai. And so Ittai says, now he says, I'm going with you. Whether it's life or death, I'm with you. What commitment. And so he says, all right, go ahead. So look at verse 23, though. I think this is one thing that David wanted to see happen. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. You've got this mass of people, all these fighting men, all these guys, and they were probably getting older. They were probably the more seasoned ones. Absalom was appealing more to the younger generation, I think. And you'll see that he's even got a new commander of his army. And so all these people now are really upset as they see this mass of people because they don't want the change. Although there may have been dissatisfaction out in Israel, it doesn't seem like there was a lot of dissatisfaction within Jerusalem itself. So the people are really upset, and the king crosses the Kidron Valley and moves on toward the wilderness. Now the priests and the Levites come with them. They know that David wants the ark of God. They know that David values the presence of God. And so they're bringing the ark with them. And so the priests and the Levites, they're carrying the ark. And I'm sure they had it covered properly, and they have the poles in it just right. And David stops them, and he says, hang on, guys. Take the ark of God back into the city. That's where it belongs. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he'll bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good. And then I love what he says here next. He looks at Zadok and he says, do you understand? Do you get it? Do you understand what I'm trying to say to you? You see, there was wisdom in what David was proposing. Not just faith. Yes, there was faith there that if God wants me to come back, I'll come back. But there was wisdom because if he kept the priests there in Jerusalem, priests can listen. And so David sets up very wisely, he sets up a spy network, if you will. He says, take your son and Abiathar's son, Jonathan, your son Ahimaaz, and you guys go back with your boys. I'm going to go on out here to the wilderness until you send me word. And so they go back, they take the ark. But David continues up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he goes. A couple of other points here. When you are blindsided by negative situations, respond in humility. Don't lash out. Respond in humility. David could have lashed out. He could have gone on a tirade. He could have said, how dare he? Who does he think he is? Why, let him come to Jerusalem. We'll take care of him. But he didn't. He responded humbly. He went out weeping. He went out sad. He was in mourning. And also, you have to be careful to worship. You'll notice that it says here, when he arrived at the summit, verse 32, it says he arrived at the summit where people used to worship God. Hushai, his friend, was there to meet him. In the King James, it makes it sound like when David arrived at the summit, he worshiped God. And whether or not he did there or not, I would encourage you, when you're faced by negative situations, not only do you need to respond humbly, but you need to respond in worship. And spend time alone with God. Get your eyes on Jesus. I shared with you back at the early on in Saul's kingship, I think it's an overall principle that whatever's right in front of your face is what influences your emotions. And when you worship, you get God right in front of you. And that influences your emotions, and you're able to survive a lot better than if you focus on those negative situations. And so whether or not David actually worshiped here or not, I'm sure he did. You'll remember a time when David came back to Ziklag and found that his family was all taken, the families of his men were taken, and the men were talking about stoning David, and it said that David did what? He encouraged himself in the Lord. And so I'm certain that David did worship as part of what was going on. But he sends it back, set up the spy network, and now he says to his friend, you see, Hushai was also an advisor. He was not as respected as Ahithophel, but almost as respected. but he was a close friend with David. He was a good buddy with David. And so Hushai is there, and he says, listen, he said, I need you to go back to the city and try to confound what Ahithophel advises. Because David knew that if, just humanly speaking, that if Absalom followed Ahithophel's advice, David was gone. And he knew that, and he's hoping and believing that if Hushai can go, he can help by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. That's the end of verse 34. And he says, listen, Zadok and Abiathar, they're going to be there with you. Tell them anything you hear, and then their sons are going to get the word to us. Well, as we jump into chapter 16 now, David is on his way out, and who comes to meet him but the servant of Mephibosheth? You remember Mephibosheth? He was the crippled son of Jonathan, and David had kept him. He was eating at David's table, and so Ziba comes. He's the guy that has been taking care of the estate of Saul and given all the proceeds to Mephibosheth. Ziba meets David, and Ziba's got a bunch of stuff for him. He's got 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, a skin of wine. And by the way, that skin of wine, I thought this was interesting. I think of a skin of wine, maybe as big as this, but like a skin. And they said, no, it was probably a goat skin filled with wine. They took a goat skin and I don't know, what do you do with it? You tan it or whatever, and then they sewed it all up. And so it was the size of a goat, but it was all full of wine. And so it's this big thing they're carrying, because it's not just for one or two people, it's for a bunch of people. So he's got a skin of wine too. And Ziba says, King says to Ziba, why have you brought these? Well, the donkeys are for your household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness. All of a sudden, Ziba is he's just bending over backwards. And so the king says, where's Mephibosheth? And from all the we don't know exactly, but in my heart, I feel like Ziba's lying here. Ziba says, oh, he's back in the city. He thinks that today he's going to be made king because you've gone. So David makes a decision in the midst of this negative situation. David makes a decision that, from my perspective, is minimally hasty and very possibly just totally wrong. He says to Ziba, well, everything that belonged to Mephibosheth, it's yours. He didn't check it out. He didn't try to find out. David's in such an emotional state. He just says, well, everything that was his, all that was Saul's, it was Mephibosheth's, now it's yours. And he bows and off he goes. I think Ziba did that on purpose. I really do. Well, now we find something else happening, and that is this guy named Shimei. Now, this guy was related to Saul. And he's coming, and David and his men, they're walking along the road. And there's a whole bunch of them there. I mean, he's got soldiers. He's got all kinds of protection. And this guy is coming along, and he's maybe a little higher elevation than what they're at. And he's yelling out curses at David. And he's throwing rocks at David. And he's saying things like, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Well, Abishai's there, and he's like, why should this dead dog curse my Lord the king? Let me go cut his head off. That would have seemed legitimate to me. I mean, he's cursing the king. He's throwing dirt and rocks at the king. David says, what does this have to do with you sons of Zeruiah? Is he cursing if he's cursing because the Lord told him to curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? Then David turns to Abishai and all of his officials. Now look at how low David is sunk here. My son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for God has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me this covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So as they're going on, this is one of the few times where we see David putting a stop to Abishai and Joab. And he says, no, you're not going to do that. So as they're going along, this guy, Shimei, he's going along with them. And he's still cursing. He's throwing stones. He's yelling the whole time as they're moving along. And so they finally reach their destination, verse 14, and they're all just worn out. Well, meanwhile, Absalom and all the men in Israel have come into Jerusalem. And Ahithophel's with them too. Hushai the Archite shows up. And he says to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. Absalom's like, is this how you show your friendship to my dad? You guys were buddies. Hushai must have been very convincing, and not to mention God wanted Absalom to believe this. He said, as I have served the Father, I will serve the Son. I'm here to serve God's anointed. And so he's kind of playing up on Absalom's own sense of self-worth. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned to you yet, and it was probably in the last chapter and I missed it, was a part of Absalom's vanity. Absalom had long hair. And he would get his hair cut, it seems, at least once a year. And when he did, it weighed, you ready for this? 5 pounds. 5 pounds. Now, I used to wonder about that. I think, man, this kid, he's got a really thick growing head of hair. One of the young ladies on the Bible quiz team that I work with, she stands about this tall. She was adopted by a family here in town, and she's got long, and she's got some of the thickest dark hair that I've ever seen on anybody. And I'm looking at thinking, Absalom, you know, if all of her hair were cut up, I don't think it would weigh 5 pounds. And as I was reading about this today, I read, and you got to remember that back in that day and time, gold was very, very plentiful. It was not like it is today. It was around. And people, because of vanity, would often take gold dust and they would spread it through their hair. So that when the sun hit it, can you imagine? I mean, real gold, when the sun hits it, it sparkles. But can you imagine if you had gold dust all through your hair? I mean, you're walking down the road and everybody's like, whoa, look at that sparkle. Oh my goodness. And it was a common thing, I guess, in that day and time. So it's likely that he had not just hair, but he may have had some gold dust, or he may have had something else mixed in with his hair that made it heavy. But he's a very, very proud young man. And so now he comes into town, and he has this little interchange with Hushai. And so Absalom turns to Ahithophel and says, all right, we're here. We're in Jerusalem. Now, he said, what do we do? What do I need to do? Well, if there had been any chance of reconciliation, the people might not have gotten behind Absalom. But if they knew there was absolutely no chance of reconciliation, it would cement their following. It would cement their loyalty to him. So Ahithophel says, your dad left 10 concubines here. Take them up on the roof in the view of all the people and sleep with them. You see, a conqueror in that day and time, a conqueror inherited everything that belonged to the one that he vanquished, including the women. And so the fact that, and Absalom said, okay, sounds like good advice to me. And so from the very place where David looked with lustful longing on somebody else's wife, somebody took 10 of his wives and slept with them. Now, it says that he did this in sight of all of Israel. You don't need to think that it was that this was the first porno example. There was a tent pitched up there. And they saw him go in, they saw the women go in, and they knew what happened. That's what they mean when they say in the sight of all Israel. And here's where we find out about Ahithophel and his advice. It says, in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So that brings us to the end of 16. And next week we're going to talk about the actual rebellion, talk about the battle and how it all ends. A lot of truth I find in this passage, and it has to do with being careful about our actions. You know, I look at the fact that up on the roof, Absalom slept with 10 of his father's wives. The very spot where David looked with lustful longing on somebody else's wife. And I'm reminded of something I told you a couple of weeks back, and that is that the sins of the fathers are amplified in the sons. And so it was here. We must always be careful of our lives because we don't know what's going to happen. That's why the only way to be safe is to be in obedience to what God commands. When I'm in obedience, I know I'm protected and I'm not planting the wrong things in the lives of the people around me. I'm not setting an example that's going to cause them to go deeper and deeper and into sin and farther away from God. And so protection is found within the boundaries of what God expects of us. So let's bow our heads. Father, thanks for the opportunity tonight. What a sad time in David's life. Seeing all these things that happen after that one night when David had to have something that wasn't his. And then all of the consequences that followed, the displeasure, almost the removal of the blessing of God on what he was doing, and now he's back to being a fugitive again. A fugitive even though he has been king. Help us to understand that there is safety only in obedience to your will and what you've expressed in your word. And I pray that as we go out from here tonight, our hearts would be drawn closer to you and we'd be more determined than ever to live in obedience to your will and your way. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Have a great week.
You too.